1988. A teenage boy called Donnie Darko is woken up by a mysterious voice.
Wake up.
He walks outside his house and meets a large talking bunny rabbit called Frank. Frank tells him that the world will end in 28 days, 6 hours, 42 minutes and 12 seconds. As they're having that conversation, a jet engine inexplicably falls from the sky and smashes its way into Donnie's empty bedroom. What's really going on here? Is Donnie Darko hallucinating, showing signs of paranoid schizophrenia? Or might Frank actually be real? In which case, is the world really about to end?
6 hours, 42 minutes, 12 seconds.
Join me as we continue our journey through the mind and body, and we discuss Richard Kelly's modern cult classic, Donnie Darko.
A fuck ass?
Welcome back to the evolution of horror. My name is Mike, and as ever, I am your host. If you're tuning in for the first time, then welcome. In this podcast, we explore and dissect the history and the evolution of the horror genre by looking at particular subgenres, one series at a time. We are currently exploring body horror and psychological horror in tandem, and this is part 21, in which we're going to be looking at one incredible cult teen classic from the early 2000s, Richard Kelly's Donnie Darko. This will be a spoilerific review. If you haven't seen Donnie Darko, what are you doing with your life? Go away and give it a watch. We will be talking about this entire film, not just the producer's cut, but we will also be talking about the director's cut. So that's just a little warning there. Lots to cover. Let's get straight into it. Joining me to discuss all things Donnie Darko, a long-time friend of the pod. I've missed him. He's a very good friend of mine. It's been a while since he was last on the podcast. I believe he was last here discussing Peter Jackson's Brain Dead with me during the zombie series. So I'm so glad to have him here again. Welcome back to the podcast, Alex Ayling. Hello.
Hi, Mike.
Hi. Oh, this is sad not being able to do this in person, right?
Oh, I missed you. I missed your face, but at least I can see your face. That's something.
It's so lovely to see your face. How's 2020 been for you?
I mean, great. Everything's brilliant. Everything is exactly as anticipated.
Yeah, fine,
it's just
right?
Everything's so easy and uncontroversial. I hate it. I hate everything about it. I have been retreating a lot into the fictional worlds, and like that's the best thing about horror. That's the best thing about film and all of that, is being able to escape. I haven't had as much time. I've got 2 young kids. It's very busy, and I think there's a different. There's this whole spectrum of people who've dealt with the pandemic. I think some people who've living on their own, that's really tough and been really hard. And then people who've got like young kids, let me tell you, that's been super tough as well. So not as much time as I had anticipated. But, I do love them, so there's that at least.
Yeah, there's that. That's nice. So let me ask you then. So we've been on this Mind and Body series for 20 weeks now. What are your thoughts on this area of the genre?
I have to say, when you sort of started talking to me about the theme for the series, I was a little bit skeptical because I thought it was a bit of a nebulous topic. But then once you explained like the kind of films that were going to be in it and the themes you were going to explore, I was like, oh, actually, it's like some of the best stuff. Some of the best stuff is in here. And yeah, I think the mind stuff as well. I've been thinking about it. Like, it's why is psychological horror so scary? Like, what is it about that? And a lot of your guests so far on the pod that I've listened to have been talking about how your body is yours, and then if your body goes out of control, that's really terrifying, and it's something super relatable. I feel like that's all amplified when you come to the mind because you can't see it. Like, if you've got a broken leg, you can see you've got a broken leg, but if there's something going on in your brain, it's really hard to know what's going on. It's sort of almost more unknowable than physical pain. I don't know, something deep and primal. And like really hard to understand.
Yeah, I agree. And there's something so scary about, it feels like only very, very, very recently that we've started to actually kind of diagnose, I suppose, mental health issues and accept them as a thing, and not just that somebody's just sane or insane, I suppose, or that somebody's just mad and they're going to be locked up or something. And that in itself is a very frightening thought. That's always been the thing that scared me in these sorts of films, those kind of gaslighting storylines, or those kind of that idea that you're mad and everyone else is sane and that you can't really convince them otherwise. That's a terrifying thing, right?
Super terrifying. The other way to frame that is, how do you defend yourself from psychological attack? Like, if someone's coming at you with a knife, you're like, oh, I could probably like dodge out the way, or I could grab my own knife, or a sharp, I don't know, a block or something, But how do you defend yourself against psychological attack, and especially if that psychological attack is coming from within yourself or from your past, or I don't know, whatever it is, like that is utterly terrifying. And you're right to call out the kind of mental health provision versus physical health provision as well. And I think it's stark, and it's really clear to see that massive difference.
Yeah, it really is. And also then it really gets nicely into the whole genre debate too, I think, because I think psychological thriller is the classic label that has been kind of stamped on. Recently we've just before this film, we've done a load of kind of those movies from the 90s that were considered not quite horror but more psychological thriller, like Silence of the Lambs and Seven and Jacob's Ladder and Lost Highway, and actually even all of the films of David Lynch. There is this slight kind of, I guess, sort of snobbiness about these films in a way that they're almost they're a bit more highbrow, maybe. They're a bit more art house. I think this also applies to Donnie Darko, doesn't it? This kind of critical darling that therefore kind of separates it a little bit from the horror genre.
Boo. Let it be shown for the podcast. I am pointing both my thumbs down. Boo to this. Boo to elevated horror. Boo to all of this. No, it's snobbery. Like, how dare you? No, absolutely not. And actually, like, this is one of the reasons why horror fans are the best, in my opinion, is like they're empathy machines. And that's why this sort of connects so strongly, is you can imagine yourself in the position of the victims, in the position of the protagonist or the antagonist in one of these stories. And one of the things that I loved about Donnie Darko, even though like this world that he is in is a million miles away from any of my world, it just felt so real and lived in, and therefore so easy. Even though it's completely outlandish, it feels completely relatable in a strange way. And I think that's got a lot to do with the performances and all sorts, but I'm sure we'll talk about all of that. But
you're absolutely right. That's an amazing balance that some of these films manage to get. And I do think, before we get into the film itself, and I'm sure we'll talk about this throughout, but it feels like it does owe a bit of a debt. And I think Richard Kelly himself has cited people like David Lynch. There's a clear connection, I think, isn't there? And let me ask you, just before we get into this film, in terms of the tradition of psychological horror films that we've covered so far, and filmmakers, David Lynch being one of the biggest, what do you think of his work? How familiar are you with Lynch and his world, his oeuvre?
It's funny because today I remembered my David Lynch origin story.
Ooh.
Which is so strange. So at my library at my secondary school, I must have been like 11 or 12, I guess it was early on. And the library at my secondary school, there was a picture, like movie tie-in novelization of Dune. David Lynch's Dune. And so that was one of the gateway drugs, I guess, into genre for me. Because I was looking at this book, and like, you can think what you like about that film, and actually I haven't watched it in years, but visually there are some arresting images.
Yes, and it stays with you. Yeah.
And to see them out of context of a film, like, I'd never read the novel, I'd never watched the film, and I wasn't really paying attention, but there was all this like kind of Baron Harkonnen and all these grotesqueries and things, and people biting on their teeth with cyanide gas and stuff, and so suddenly today I realized, like, oh, that was my first exposure to David Lynch. Like, that is not the typical way in.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah,
and then I guess, like, I was a latecomer to art house cinema. Like, I've always loved films, but I'm very much, you know, blockbuster first came that populist first came through, and then I've never had any kind of artistic training or critical training like I did science at university. So I never got exposed to the kind of film school menu, or, you know, the film school diet or anything like that. And then, but then I guess sort of gradually coming to it more and more and realizing, like, I really dig it. Like, I really dig it. And then following along with this, you know, with your main series, and then especially I've been on a Twin Peaks rewatch of all my many rewatches over. That's what I've really been doing in lockdown, is rewatching. I've been rewatched Twin Peaks. I've rewatched Buffy. I've rewatched Battlestar Galactica. Like, all the greats,
all the best things,
all the greats. That's been nice. But so having the very sort of intelligent and lovely people that you have guests, having someone to not physically talk to, because I don't talk to anybody these days, but having some other people talking about those things and having conversations about them has really opened them up in a way that hadn't before. And it was something you said about David Lynch doesn't care about the story, he cares about how you feel. And I was like, oh yeah, exactly. And he's the master of it.
He is the master of it. He's the pure, unfiltered mood and emotion. And I think as soon as you know that going into one, you can really enjoy it so much more, I think. Having said that, I still spend hours trying to figure out in a kind of cerebral way what's really going on in Twin Peaks: The Return, which is probably a huge waste of my time. But it's still quite fun. Exactly. It's still quite fun. And, well, that tees us up nicely for this film, because I think there's a really interesting mix of kind of sci-fi and the cerebral, along with the kind of art house and emotional and psychological here. So let's talk about Richard Kelly's Donnie Darko then, from 2001.
So why'd you move here?
My mom had to get a restraining order against my stepdad. He has emotional problems.
Oh, I have those too. What kind of emotional problems does your dad have? I met a new friend.
Real or imaginary?
Your cup, Donnie.
Imaginary.
I'm going to tell you a little story today about a young man whose life was completely destroyed by these instruments of fear.
I've been seeing stuff.
Donnie is experiencing what is commonly called a daylight hallucination.
I have to obey him. He saved my life.
Have you ever seen a portal?
Has he ever told you about his friend Frank, the giant bunny rabbit?
The what?
Donnie Darko is a student in an affluent neighborhood in California. The year is 1988, and we meet Donnie at the top of a hill with his bike, where he has cycled in his sleep. And we quickly find out that Donnie is a troubled young man. He returns to his home, and we meet the rest of his family. We see him at school, and then at some point in the night, he is disturbed by a voice telling him to wake up. And that voice belongs to, I guess, like a 7-foot rabbit with a metal head. And this rabbit is called Frank. Frank lures him from his bed on another sleepwalking adventure. And while he's out on this particular adventure, a jet engine crashes through the roof of his house and crushes where he would have been sleeping. The weird thing about this jet engine is that no plane is missing an engine. And we go on a long journey of metaphysical time travel and spirituality and mental health. And a not fun time is had by most people.
Beautifully put. Absolutely beautiful plot synopsis, Alex. So, tell me, first of all, let me ask you, what's your own personal relationship and history with Donnie Darko?
I love this film. Mm-hmm. I love this film. I remember seeing a trailer for it at the cinema and being utterly enthralled and entranced and desperate to see this film. And so I saw it as soon as it came out. I watched it in the cinema. and it was incredible. And then it became, one of those first. I think I must have bought it on VHS, rather than DVD. And it became one of those go-to movies, where I was thinking about this as well. Like before streaming services, you just had a selection that was available to you, unless something good was on TV, which invariably wasn't. You had your go-to selection, and I had a lot of videos because I was very fortunate to be able to get them and work in a cinema that paved the way to buy more videos and self-fulfilling prophecy. So it was one of the ones that it became a go-to, like Friday night after the pub, come home, put Donnie Darko on, or it was just, I guess, comfort food. It's just, it's so easy to watch, so difficult to understand, but so easy to watch. And the music's so good and everything's just so great about it that, it became one of those films that sort of lodges in you. And then, I don't know, it feels, I saw you talking about the fact that you were watching it on Twitter, and then there were so many people replying like, oh, it's my favorite. I love it so much. And it feels like one of those touchstone movies.
It means a lot to a lot of people, I think. I remember I saw it when I was at school, thought it was the coolest thing ever, and there were so many people of my age group who just... It was that sort of movie for people of my generation where I was a sort of... trying to be edgy, moody teenager, and this was like the coolest, edgiest, weirdest, most alternative kind of teen movie at the time that you could really like. It was either that at the time or it was like American Pie, basically. So it was like, this is so cool, and the music was really cool, and it didn't quite make sense, and it was amazing actors in it. Everything else, it's kind of scary and weird. I love it as well, and I really, really enjoyed rewatching it actually this week because it felt like it had been a long time since I'd last seen it. What about you? What were your thoughts, rewatching it for this podcast? Do you still love it just as much as you did back in the day?
It stands up. It definitely stands up. And weirdly, it's set in 1988. It's in the year of a presidential election. There's some like shenanigans going on from that point of view. All the sort of talk about mental health. It still feels relevant, and I don't know whether that's because it's timeless or because we just haven't moved on. But
I know I think that's what's very clever about it. It's period set, I suppose, but in quite a subtle way. It doesn't do 80s in the way that some films do 80s, but it does feel kind of timeless in a lot of ways, I think. Let me maybe start off by asking you about that, because in some ways it's something I always forget until I press play and it starts and it comes up and it says 1988. I almost forget that it's set in the 80s.
Here's a thought for you.
Yeah, go on.
If you were making a period piece today...
Yes.
It would be at the time that Donnie Darko was coming out, and it would be the same distance.
Oh,
no, wouldn't
that's
it?
Weird.
It would be even longer.
Yes, because what was it? 1988
that was only
to 2001.
That was only 13 years.
Yeah, so it'd be like setting a film in 2006 or 2007.
Yeah.
Fuck.
Yeah.
That's weird, isn't it?
That is weird.
That's weird because, I find it so much harder to decipher now. How would you characterize 2007? Somehow it's like it feels like a much harder thing to do than 1988 did.
Yeah, I guess it would be like, I don't know, Landfill Indie and The Cribs and a load of like guitar bands.
Yeah, it would, but it wouldn't be quite as fun or interesting when it came to like sort of costumes and stuff like that. Mind you, Greta Gerwig's Lady Bird did that and did quite a good job of it, didn't it? But
that's true. We're going off topic again.
We're going off topic.
It's because we haven't seen each other for so long.
I know. We've got so much to catch up on. Well, let me ask you, first of all, that choice of setting it in 1988, do you think there's a reason for that? Do you think there's a creative reason, a political reason? Why is this film set in 1988, do you think?
That's a great question. I've never even thought about that. I wonder if it's one of those things where it gives you, it takes away a lot of the things that make storytelling hard. It takes away technology. It takes away, because of the plot developments. There's no internet, and the plot developments then with Patrick Swayze's character, could only have happened really at that time. Motivational speaking, and all that sort of like, I guess, quackery was.
Yes.
I mean, it's. I guess you could argue it hasn't really gone away, but I don't. An excuse to just use some really kick-ass alternative rock music, like
I think that's it, isn't it?
It makes it cooler.
I think there is that, and I think there are some more negative critiques of this film that do, you know, accuse it of being maybe a bit style over substance. That it is a very cool film, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, in that sort of Tarantino-y way, where it's kind of all about the look, the cast, the soundtrack, the whole kind of world and style that this film creates, maybe is more important than the story or the subtext. I don't know if I agree with that, but there is an element of that, isn't there? I think probably to setting it in the 80s.
Yeah,
well.
for sure, it's a tone piece.
Yeah,
it's absolutely a tone piece, and I think that's fine. Like take it for what it is. You know, that contributes to the way that you feel about it and the sort of emotions that you have, and that's clearly what he was aiming for. I mean, we can talk a bit about Richard Kelly. I think it's interesting you mentioned the Lynch connection. So I've got the glorious Arrow edition, and there's his original student film is on there as well, and that pays a heavy debt to David Lynch. Also, let me tell you, and so you can he's wearing his influence on his sleeve.
Well, it's an incredible feature debut, isn't it? Because, like you said, he'd made a couple of shorts before this, but this was Richard Kelly's first film. He was pretty young when he made it too, and
it's a super confident debut. It feels like he's in film school and he's thinking about all this stuff and he's got this idea and he bursts out, and I'm sure it must have been an incredible script in order to get the kind of backing of Drew Barrymore, who I think was one of the producers that helped put it together, and then you know, get her in, but then the cast that they got and everybody, he must have been a very impressive individual to have been able to do all of that. And it feels like he sort of burst in, had this thing, and then, I mean, who knows what happened after that? Maybe he believed his own hype, or maybe it was just he got it all out of his system.
Yeah.
Or
it's really interesting as well. I mean, when you think about the background of this film, the fact that we're seeing the producer's cut and the director's cut is something very different. So I think there is this is clearly a film made collaboratively, I think, by a team. And I think especially when you look at some of his later films, he's never really had the success. He's never really made anything as successful or as good as Donnie Darko. So it is a really interesting little phenomenon, this standalone film.
Absolutely. And whoever the producers were and whatever influence they had, like, they did exactly the right thing.
They did.
To make the movie exactly the way it should have been. And they knew when to hold back, and they knew when not to over-explain it. And
yeah, it's really interesting that, isn't it? Because you wouldn't think that would often be the producers that would do that. But it's really interesting. But we'll talk about that in a bit. Let me ask you about the cast. Actually, let's start by just talking about Jake Gyllenhaal. Oh. Jake Gyllenhaal, who was, this was his breakthrough role, really, wasn't it, as well? And again, oh my God, like, if you just think of all the roles that he's had since, but what do you think of him in this film as a young Donnie Darko?
I just love him. He's just great. He's just so good. It's such an assured, vulnerable, funny, well considered, enigmatic performance. It's just got everything, and like, rightly so, he was immediately catapulted onto the stage of and he's just been doing great work ever since. And I just think extraordinary, like, well done for whoever cast him and his sister as his sister.
And that's amazing as well, isn't
so
it? Actually,
good.
They're both really good. He's brilliant. What a perfect balance of kind of cool, likeable but weird and sort of dangerous and a bit creepy. He's kind of all of these things in one, where you kind of love him and you kind of want to be him, but also he's a bit of a wrong-un in a lot of ways as well, and like, but yet still so likable and so relatable at the same time. He's awesome.
I mean, he murders someone in this film.
He murders someone, but also he's that kind of man of the people, stands up for things and stands up for people, and I guess he's almost like some of those kind of 70s anti-heroes that you see, like Travis Bickle or somebody like that in some ways, maybe slightly less problematic than some of those, but it's that kind of thing where it's kind of like he's cool even though he's clearly, got issues, right? And it's really interesting.
He's got a very different kind of anti-authority
Yeah.
kind of vibe to him, whereby it's not like fighting against the man, but it is spotting injustices, and there's a few tiny things he does which really endear him, and I mean Donnie as a character to me, like when he stands up for Charita at the bus stop, and things, just little things like that, and the fact that, you know, he clearly has affection for his sisters, and there's little things like that where I'm just like, oh, you're just troubled and you're having a hard time with whatever it is with your metaphysical existence, transdimensional worries.
Absolutely. And times when he's, you know, teenagers are children basically, and I think sometimes a lot of teen movies forget that, especially teen movies of this era. You know, I mentioned American Pie, but also anything written by Kevin Williamson. We've talked about this time and time again about how they all basically act like they're about 30. And,
most of them are being played by 30-year-olds at the time as well.
Exactly, right? Exactly. Whereas Jake Gyllenhaal as Donnie Darko, again, you there are moments when he seems more mature, but then there are moments when he literally kind of becomes sort of infantilized. You know, like when he's being hypnotized on the sofa, or he starts crying or blubbering, or, you know, there are just these little moments when you're reminded that, like, yeah, this is just a troubled kid ultimately, and
totally.
it's in some ways quite a sad story. You know,
where that second hypnosis where he ends up having to cuddle the teddy.
Yeah.
I have to obey him or I'll be left all alone. And then I won't be able to figure out what this is all about. I won't be able to know his master plan.
Do you mean God's master plan? Do you now believe in God?
I have the power to build a time machine.
How is that possible? How is time travel possible, Donnie?
Time's up, Frank said.
When is this going to happen?
Soon.
He's phenomenal, and I've loved everything Jake Gyllenhaal has done since. You know, he's one of the few actors for me who is usually like a stamp of, I will probably go see it if he's in it. You know, everything from like Zodiac to what's it called,
Nightcrawler.
Oh, Nightcrawler. Like, he does slightly weird off-kilter films that are always interesting in some way or another, you know?
I'm ready for the next era of Jake Gyllenhaal. Like, he was the baddie in the latest Spider-Man film, and he was great in that. Like, I'm happy.
He was good, but I don't want to see him disappear into the Marvel Cinematic Universe.
Sure. Well, you know, spoilers for Spider-Man. I don't think that's going to happen. But
no, okay, yeah, true.
But I would be super happy for him to have a franchise. Like, Let's give him a big franchise. Like, look what it did for Chris Pratt.
Yeah, but and he absolutely deserves it. You know, he's so good and very diverse. You know, I think he's awesome. So let's get to the crux of the story of this film. Let me ask you. I mean, we talked at the beginning about this strange kind of genre hybrid that you get sometimes when it comes to sort of films that deal with the mind and psychological films. How would you class Donnie Darko? Because, you know, some people might think this is a psychological horror film or a thriller, a teen movie, a coming-of-age story. Is it sci-fi? And I think there is that tension, isn't there, of is what's going on in this world real, in which case it makes it sci-fi, or is it all in his head, in which case it makes it a psychological thriller?
Oh, I don't know. I'm really worried that if I say it's not a horror film, you're going to kick me off halfway through, and we'll just that's the end.
You're allowed. I promise.
I've never considered it to be a horror film, and I don't know what that says about me. Because I found it, you know, I did find it, certainly the first time I watched it, I found Frank terrifying. Yeah. And certainly it has some sort of classic horror elements, and it has the sort of horror soundtrack, and you know, there's definite elements of the uncanny. Yeah. And so I guess in my head, I always thought it was a sci-fi film, but really, like, is it though? You know, there's a reading. Like, what's the reading of this film? Like, how much of it actually happens? Is it time travel? Is it transdimensional? Whatever it is it all in his head? Don't know. I don't want to know. I don't want to solve the mystery. And so for me, like, I think it sort of defies genre in that way. That's a
does.
really wanky thing to say. I'm sorry, but I did it.
No, it absolutely does. In the same way that Lynch does, right? I mean, you couldn't necessarily call Twin Peaks just horror.
No,
but it's got so much horror in it. It's
as much of a soap opera as it is horror.
Yeah, exactly. Same with Blue Velvet. But there are absolutely horrific moments, and I think the first scene where we see Frank, the moment when Donnie is woken up, and even just hearing Frank's voice saying "Wake
Frank's
up, Donnie."
Voice is horrifying.
If you have the speakers up loud at that moment, the sound.
Wake up.
Wake up.
Oh, it's phenomenal, and the look of Frank. Let me ask you a bit about Frank. I mean, again, what do you think of him? The way that he looks. It's a bunny rabbit, right? But it's like the most horrific bunny rabbit you've ever seen. I just
marvel that this thing exists. And if you look up the production art, you can see all the different kind of variants of what Frank might have looked like. And we ended up with the best one, let me tell you. But like, I don't know, again, just the kind of the kind of alchemy that went into this film, all of the different elements coming together, everybody working on it at the top of their games, being brilliant, including whomever designed this bunny costume and the mask, because it is terrifying and frightening.
It is.
And the voice, and that the wobbly wall in the bathroom, that's that kind of the barrier between Frank and Donnie, and he tries to attack it with the knife, and all that kind of stuff, and the creeping tension of the music that builds behind it. Just everything is just working in concert to just create this sort of this. Even thinking about it now, like my stomach is tightening with the kind of tension that is built by all of those elements together. But I think Frank is a key part of why this film resonates.
And it is, again, it's that mix of, like we were saying, the sort of child fantasy with horror as well, isn't it? Like the fact that it's a giant bunny rabbit. That a boy has an imaginary friend that's a giant talking rabbit, but it's in the most like grotesque, uncanny way imaginable, which just makes it all the more uneasy and uncomfortable. The first time I saw it, I was probably young. I was about 14. I found it scary, like properly scary, this film, particularly those moments with Frank. And I think the fact that you don't really know what genre it fits in, and you don't really know what film it is you're watching when you first see it, makes it even more scary in a way, because you're put in quite an uncomfortable place. It's like, what is this film? Is this a comedy, a teen film, a drama, a horror? And it never... I still don't, like we said, it kind of defies it. I still don't know to this day what it is, but I think that all adds to it, doesn't it?
And it doesn't give you any cues. It doesn't give you a clue of what's going to happen next. It doesn't tell you anything about it. It just plays some like atmospheric 80s bangers, and then you're off, and then all these people are just real people, and you're lulled into. That's probably one of the more subtle but important Lynch influences is the reality of these sort of people's lives, and the sort of banality of dinner time, where they're all sitting around the dinner table eating dinner together, and like the kind of classic family arguments. And
Do you honestly think Michael Dukakis will provide for this country till you're ready to squeeze one out?
Yeah, I do.
When can I squeeze one out?
Not until 8th grade.
Donnie, you're such a dick.
Whoa, Elizabeth. A little hostile there. Maybe you should be the one in therapy, then Mom and Dad can pay someone $200 an hour to listen to all your thoughts, so we don't have to.
Okay. Do you want to tell Mom and Dad why you stopped taking your medication?
You're such a fuck-ass.
What?
Please.
Did you just call me a fuck ass?
Elizabeth, that's enough.
You can go suck a fuck.
Oh, please tell me, Elizabeth, how exactly does one suck a fuck?
You want me to tell you?
Please, tell me.
We will not have this at the dinner table. Stop.
What's a fuck ass?
It was a couple of years after, or maybe 1 year after, American Beauty had just won Best Picture as well, which again, kind of in its own weird way, also quite inspired by Lynch and Blue Velvet. And but I think that was partly what kind of I remember even then, people using American Beauty as a weird kind of comparison when people were sort of selling this film at the time, which is a strange thing. But I guess you can see it in those moments, like you say, the kind of people sat around the dinner table, or the different kind of quirky, quaint characters, waving to each other on their garden lawns or whatever.
What I like about the film as well is like it's not archetypes.
Yes.
It's not like, I love John Hughes films, but it's not John Hughes's high school. It's not the jocks versus the nerds versus the freaks versus whomever, whatever tribe. Like, everybody is complicated and has layers and is doing different things, and and to its credit, that makes them all feel a lot more real.
Yeah.
As a result.
We've touched upon it already, but let me ask you about the soundtrack. I mean, it kicks off, doesn't it, with... Is it Echo in the Bunnyman we get at the beginning?
The Killing Moon.
Oh, The Killing Moon. We get that incredible sequence with the Tears for Fears, head over heels.
Oh, I love that so much. I can't even tell you.
And again, I was lucky enough to interview Richard Kelly for the BBC a few years ago. He was so lovely, actually, and really, really happy to chat about this film that he's probably chatted about 1,000,001 times. But he told me that this idea, it feels like quite a Tarantino thing. He said that this idea of this song and this track and this montage came before the rest of the story. He knew he wanted to have this moment where a kid jumps off the school bus, and at that moment, the Tears for Fears comes in. Bang.
You can see it's such an authored sequence. It reminds me of Edgar Wright in a way.
Yes.
The way Baby Driver. That's the whole film of like that. It's been in his head. It's that same kind of thing. Mm-hmm. And I just feel like that whole sequence, like, he is showing off so much. He totally gets away with it. And it's like, if you try to describe the sequence, it's like sort of a mix between slow-mo and hyperlapse, and you go down the corridor and you see all the main players, and there's a 80s soft rock ballad playing. You're like, this sounds shit.
It sounds so film school, doesn't it?
Yeah, it's absolutely pure film school, and he gets away with it. I love it. I love that sequence.
It works. It works so well, and not only does it work in a just kind of very superficial style way, but I love. It's a really lovely way to introduce us to all of these characters as well, because it is weirdly, it's Donnie Darko. It's called Donnie Darko, but also it's quite an ensemble piece, isn't it? And again, I almost forget until every time I watch it just how many people are in this film and how many famous people are in this film. And we get the kids jumping on the trampoline as well, and we've got the family, and we've got the mother reading It in the garden. Yes. We've got some Stephen King references there, and then we go to the school and we see the teachers. We've got Drew Barrymore. We've got, what's his name, Carter from ER.
Noah Wilde.
All of that, like, just so many people pop up. That incredible character, the gym teacher, who I absolutely love. Who don't you think is just pure? She should be Nadine from Twin Peaks. I feel like she's Nadine.
100%. She just needs an eye patch.
Yeah, totally. But it's a lovely sequence where we're introduced to all of these weird and wonderful characters.
And you understand all of those characters.
Yeah.
In that whole thing, you understand all of those characters, exactly. Seth Rogen, yeah. His first ever film. Yeah. Crazy times.
Mad, absolutely mad.
You won from The Graduate. What's her name? Catherine Ross?
Yes, yeah, absolutely.
I love it.
I know. It's amazing, isn't
Academy
it?
Award nominee, Mary McDonnell.
Oh, Laura Roslin.
So say we all.
Laura Roslin.
So say we all. There's one person in that I don't know if you spotted, who has got the tiniest part, but in a film that you and I both love to the ends of the earth.
No.
So the guy who's in Frank's car in the passenger seat, dressed as a clown, who jumps out.
Yes, I really recognised him. Who was he?
It's Frank Kranz.
Who's that?
From Cabin in the Woods. And Dollhouse, like the Whedonverse.
Oh my God!
Yeah,
I knew I recognised him. Like watching it again, I never bothered to look up who he was. That's amazing.
Yeah, there's just that's a deep bench. Let's put it that way.
I love it. He must have been super young then.
Yeah,
at that
I
point.
think it's probably
I guess a teenager.
It must have been one of his first roles as well, I guess.
Yeah, God, that's amazing. Yeah, it's and of course the girlfriend is great as well, Jenna Malone.
Jenna Malone, she's
who's
brilliant.
been in the Hunger Games and loads of other stuff since as well.
Oh, I love her. She's great, and this is a great performance from her as well. I mean, everybody gives a great performance.
Yeah, I know. Do you have a favourite character here in this kind of big ensemble? Collection of characters other than Donnie Darko.
Other than Donnie, I do love Drew Barrymore as the teacher.
I love Drew Barrymore as well. When you first introduced to her, you think, oh, she's horrible. When she makes Jenna Malone's character choose the cutest boy to sit
I know,
next to.
but the delivery of the line, shh, let her choose. I just love it. It's so great. And the bit where she comes after she's been fired and she goes out on the football pitch and just screams, fuck! I just love everything about her in it. Yeah.
You can imagine that there are so many teachers out there that would love to do some of the things that she does and says, right? As well.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And she almost, I don't know, she almost feels like the future. She's coming and they try and ban her Graham Greene book and
she's one of those awesome teachers that everyone has at least one of those teachers that kind of shapes them when they're young, and it often is actually an English teacher, I think, a lot of the time, but these kind of teachers who you think, oh, actually are really cool or help teach you something about life or about the world or something, and you feel like she is that character in this, and she is that to Donnie Darko, even though actually you get so little of them really interacting, like Donnie Darko with her. It barely happens at all, does it? But you feel that there's a sort of connection between them.
One of my favourite exchanges is with her and Carter from ER.
Yeah.
Sitting, and they're just having their packed lunch in the staff room, and she just looks at he looks at her and he goes, Donnie Darko, and she says, I know. And that's it. But it just it tells you so much. And I love that was worthy of an entire setup.
So good.
Like an entire set, an entire thing was made just for them to do that.
Yeah. And it does, like you say, it tells you a lot, doesn't it, with that? It really does. It's so good.
I think this film must have been like percolating and building in his head for a long time, because all these characters feel so well rounded and
That's
realised.
What it is, isn't it? It's lived in. This world feels lived in, even though, as we know, there is a longer cut and there's a lot that's being cut out from this, but it feels like we're just dropping into little scenes with these characters, but there is more beyond those scenes. Like there is a whole world here, isn't there?
It's funny when you talk about world building, people normally think you're talking about Middle Earth or Westeros or whatever it is, but world building is important in every single film you ever make, and this entire thing feels lived in. All of his mates, everybody, every bit part, everybody has got a backstory. You know what they're there to do. Even if they've got one line, they feel real, and that's an extraordinary achievement as well.
And they somehow feel important as well. There is there's that Lynchian thing where you think, oh, what does that character? How do they fit in this? Some of the most minor characters, you think, oh, they're going to be important in some way or another, even if they're not ultimately.
Because everybody is important.
Everybody is important in their own way.
That's the insight,
Grandma Death as well.
Yes.
I mean, she's an interesting character as well, isn't she? And again, it's like we feel like we really only kind of scratch the surface of her and what she's all about, really.
Roberta Sparrow,
indeed. Yeah. Hello there, I am interrupting this conversation momentarily to take a minute to thank this week's sponsor, because this week's sponsor is $20 patron Steve Hunt. A huge thank you to Steve for his very, very generous donation. We have now added a new price tier to our Patreon page. If you sign up at a $20 level, or if you upgrade to a $20 level, you, like Steve, will become an official sponsor of EOH podcast, which means you'll get this very special segment dedicated to you, and you'll also get to give us a little message which we will read out on the show. If you have a podcast that you want to plug, or a blog or anything like that, then I can do that right here. If you want to send in a little review for me to read out, then I can do that. If you want to simply dedicate your episode to a friend or family member or loved one, then I can do that. Anything you want, basically. If you become a $20 patron, I'll say anything you want me to say on this podcast. So Steve Hunt has said he didn't have anything necessarily to plug, but this is quite interesting. He wrote me a little message to say that thanks to the podcast, he checked out Giallo for the first time. He had never heard of Giallo before listening to EOH. And now, thanks to the podcast, he's seen a whole bunch. And he actually sent me his top 10 list, his top 10 Gialli that he has seen. It's a really interesting list, so I am going to run through Steve Hunt's top 10 Giallo movies. So at number 10, he's got The Strange Vice of Mrs. Ward. At number 9, Your Vice is a Locked Room and Only I Have the Key. Such a good title. Number 8, Deep Red, Profondo Rosso. Number 7, Don't Torture a Duckling, incredible film. Number 6, Tenebrae. Number 5, The Fifth Chord. Number 4, A Lizard in a Woman's Skin. Number 3, A Bay of Blood, aka Twitch of the Death Nerve. Number 2, The Bird with the Crystal Plumage. And his number 1 Giallo movie, it's one of the first, if not arguably the first, Mario Bava's Blood and Black Lace. That's an incredible list, Steve. I love all of the ones on that list, at least out of the ones I've seen. I've never seen The Strange Vice of Mrs. Ward, and I've never seen The Fifth Chord, so I might have to check those out, but all of the rest are so good. I'm with you on Blood and Black Lace. I think it's one of the best. It's one of the most beautiful and the most gory. I also kind of love Don't Torture a Duckling, Lucio Fulci's Don't Torture a Duckling. I think personally for me that, and Deep Red, actually, you've got them at number 7 and 8. They would probably be higher up. They'd probably be in my top 3, I reckon. But it's a really, really great list. I'd love to hear what other people think of Steve Hunt's Giallo list. So there you go. One more time, a huge thank you to this week's sponsor, $20 patron Steve Hunt. Now, if you want to sign up and become a patron either at a $20 level or at a lower tier, then head on over to patreon.com/evolutionofhorror. You'll get tons and tons of benefits depending on which level you sign up to. If you sign up on a $5 level, you'll get regular bonus episodes, 1, possibly 2 episodes per month. That could be anything from a mailbag episode to a filmmaker interview. Last week, we released an interview with filmmaker Brandon Cronenberg. Also kind of seasonal specials. A couple of weeks ago, as it was Friday the 13th, we did a Friday the 13th double bill, and in a couple of weeks' time we'll be doing a Christmas special in which me, Becky Dark and Stevie Webb will be discussing Silent Night, Deadly Night and Krampus. Cannot wait. If you want to sign up at a higher tier than that, you can go to $10 or more, and for that price you will get weekly bonus episodes, a bonus episode every single week, and that includes access to our exclusive bonus mini-seasons, such as our Extreme season, in which we're talking about some of the most notorious movies ever made, and our Twin Peaks season, which is finally coming to an end, in which we discuss the whole of Twin Peaks from the pilot all the way through to Twin Peaks The Return and that iconic finale. We recently announced what our new mini-seasons are going to be that kick off in the new year, and here's a little sample.
How do you do? My name is Alfred Hitchcock, and I would like to tell you about my forthcoming lecture. It is about the birds and their age-long relationship with man.
They're coming! They're coming!
What a guy. The incredible Alfred Hitchcock there. That is what we've got kicking off in the new year for $10 patrons. A brand new exclusive mini-season on the films of Alfred Hitchcock. We're going to be discussing in depth everything from Rebecca to Shadow of a Doubt to Notorious to Rear Window, Vertigo, and of course, The Birds. We've also got a couple of franchise seasons coming up as well, where we're going to be going through all of the Hellraiser movies and the Saw movies in depth. So we've got so much incredible content coming up. So for $10, you can get access to all of that. Anybody who signs up at any tier will get sent an Evolution of Horror sticker if they are UK based, and everybody who signs up gets a little shout out as a thank you on the main podcast. Speaking of, I'm going to give everybody who signed up in the last couple of weeks a very special thank you. So, a huge thanks to Dan the Benevolent Patron, Christopher Forrest, Leslie Medina, Gareth Moses, Joanne Parlett, Joanne Heaton, Claire Rita Hines, Stephanie Pasternak, Catherine Dutcher, Jake Castonia, Rob Duca, RB, Maria Jarrup, Matthias Corman, John Cairns, Peter Slattery, Selena, Leanne Wayne, Bendick, Matt, Jane Humphreys, Sylvie Tate, Rebecca Richardson, Kathleen Benelak, Orlando Gonzalez III, Richard, Leonard Kelly, David McCartney, Joseph Hodgson, Alicia Perkins, Carlos, Adam, and Manish Argawal. Thank you so much to all of those people for donating your hard-earned cash to supporting the evolution of horror. And one more time, if you want to sign up to Patreon and get treated to a ton of bonus goodies, then sign up now. Patreon.com/evolution of horror. That's patreon.com/evolution of horror. Okay, let's return to the second half of our discussion as me and Alex continue our deep dive of Richard Kelly's Donnie Darko. Let me ask you briefly, I mean, we mentioned, there's a Stephen King reference overtly in the opening of this film. There's lots of kind of kids on bikes and that kind of thing, and it's really hard now to watch it and not think of stuff like Stranger Things. And it feels like we've in the last decade seen 1,000,001 films and TV shows that have in some way evoked Stephen King or John Carpenter and the 80s, right? I almost forget that Donnie Darko is one of those things in a way, and maybe it was too early, but do you think that Donnie Darko is in any way responsible for this now extremely popular trend of kind of, evoking that nostalgia?
I don't actually, because this film doesn't fetishize the 80s. It just is a film that is set there. Whereas if you look at, I don't know, Super 8,
yes,
or some J.J. Abrams, like that is a love letter to films of the 80s. That and Stranger Things again is trading off the genre films of the 80s. This is a product of its own time that happens to be set in the 80s. It's not trading off slasher tropes or horror tropes from the 80s. It's not a big concept like that. It feels very millennial, actually. Like it feels super. I can feel that kind of millennial angst, and I mean millennial in both senses of the word, like the millennial angst that everybody was feeling around the turn of the century, like what does it mean, all of that kind of stuff, but also the angst of the millennial generation. And I can feel like I'm assuming Richard Kelly is, if not millennial, then sort of on the cusp of it.
Oh, definitely, yeah.
And you can see that sense of like the generation that's come above, the boomer generation. I'm not gonna turn this into an OK Boomer rant, but I think there is a lot to be said for that generation who were born in peacetime and took a lot for granted. The greed of the 80s, everybody with their big pension funds, and people, try and talk to like an 18-year-old now and tell them that there are people who retired on their full salary and they just don't work. They stopped working at like 60, 55 and still get the full salary that they got when they were working every year until they die. Like that is nuts that anybody thought that was a sustainable system. And it felt like that generation like pulled the ladder up behind them. And I can see a lot of that encapsulated, if not in the text, in the subtext of how the kids in this movie are all acting and, the whole milieu.
Definitely, I 100% agree. And I think you're right. It doesn't really fetishize the 80s in that way, although there are plenty of pop culture references, aren't there? Like we've talked about the soundtrack, we've talked about characters reading Stephen King. There's a whole sequence where they go watch The Evil Dead in the cinema as well. There's
and a double bill with The Last Temptation of Christ.
Yeah, so good, so good. There are a couple of references, of course, to Back to the Future as well. But again, I suppose that's just part of this world that Richard Kelly himself is creating, right? I mean, I don't know whether there's anything more to it than that in terms of, what they're doing here with referencing movies and pop culture and that kind of thing, other than that it's in this kind of teen-centric world, I suppose.
But it's not, it's not like it's Cyndi Lauper And
No.
and when they use Duran Duran, they use Notorious. They don't use Rio or any of the other bigger kind of party hits. It's not Wham.
No, and also even using Duran Duran at that moment feels quite ironic, I think, because I think the whole Sparkle Motion pop group is supposed to be a bit satirical, I think, isn't it? In some
more than a
way or
bit.
another?
Yeah, it's a symptom of everything else that's wrong with this. The over sexualization of prepubescent girls is not something that should be glorified in this sense.
Exactly. And the fact that this pop group have been managed and organized by this awful woman who is also at the same time as producing this kind of, like you say, over sexualized girl group, is trying to get books banned at the school for being pornographic or whatever, and follows this kind of cult leader-esque motivational speaker.
All over America, people have come together to join hands. People who believe that human life is absolutely too important, too valuable, and too precious to be controlled by fear. Hello, my name is Jim Cunningham, and welcome to Controlling Fear.
Oh, the hypocrisy of it is just, I love, because it doesn't like bash you over the head with it. And there's no like big reveal of his kiddie porn dungeon, and there are things that you can spot, like in the videos where he's like, you can sort of see him like he's a bit handsy with some of the kids in the video and stuff. And you're just like, when you're watching it again, knowing what's coming, you're like, oh, the clues were all there.
What a brilliant performance from the late great Patrick Swayze, who again we associate with the 80s. I associate him with the 80s, and also being quite wholesome and being an all-round good guy, a handsome leading man, and then for him to play this horrible, abhorrent, creepy child molester in this film is so good, and he's so good in it, right?
What a brilliant subversion, and I love it. I completely agree, because you get to have your cake and eat it that way, because you get the sort of 80s references, but you also get to kind of put two fingers up at it and sort of say, like, this is not
it's fake.
It's not looking back on the 80s of like, oh, wasn't it a glorious time where we all got to play outside and lifetimes were simpler and it was easy. It's like, no, this is a realistic look of, the kind of the underbelly of what, I guess Reagan's America was really about.
Yeah, I love it. It's a really interesting kind of slight kind of B plot, I suppose, and I guess that's also the there's a kind of slightly sprawling nature, I suppose, to this film, isn't there? Where again, it's like you set up in the plot. It's like Donnie Darko leaves his bedroom and doesn't get squashed by the jet engine, and therefore the rest of the story kind of explores the ripple effect, doesn't it, that event has on everyone else in this town. So we kind of go off in all these different kind of little directions in a way, and it can feel a bit kind of crazy and sprawling at times, I think, can't it? But I think it brings it back together again quite nicely at the end. Yeah,
it's I'm not clever enough to make this parallel, but it almost feels like there's a lot of talk around God and the weird things that come out of the solar plexus, that look like the alien from The Abyss. Have you seen the James Cameron film?
It's so The Abyss, isn't it? Yeah.
And this idea of like predestination and free will and all of that is explored, and it feels like everyone is on their path. And is it Donnie's job to break that, to give everybody free will, like as he by seeing all of those paths, like that amazing sequence at the party where he has the revelation and then the bagpipes kick in and that bagpipe solo in that amazing song, and then everybody's like bits are all going
following
through,
their tubes. Yeah, I know. I love that. And did you see the TV show Devs?
Oh, I loved it. I love Devs.
So good, so underrated.
If you haven't watched Devs, watch Devs. I don't know if it's on iPlayer anymore, but that was it.
It's a fascinating. It's one of my favorite kind of topics in sci-fi. It's also explored in a lot of Justin Benson and Aaron Moorhead's films, like Resolution. This idea of are we being controlled by something bigger than us? Is there predeterminism versus free will and that kind of stuff? And there's a lot of that being explored here in Donnie Darko.
I had not made that connection. Between Devs and Donnie Darko. What a brilliant thing.
Oh, Devs does it in a lot more depth, but
yeah, right. It's the A plot of Devs, I guess.
Exactly,
it's in my top 2 of TV of the year, I'd say.
Incredible, right? Absolutely incredible. So let's go back to this idea of kind of psychological horror. I mean, how do you think this film handles the what Donnie Darko as a character is going through? I mean, if we were to look at this as a psychological film about a boy, at one point a kind of his counselor sort of says to him, his psychiatrist says to him, he may have some sort of paranoid schizophrenia or something. What do you make of that? Do you think this is a film about a boy with some sort of mental illness, or do you think there's something else going on in this film? How do you kind of see that?
I mean, great question. I wonder whether Donnie is actually the only sane one. Like, is that what we're supposed to think? He's the visionary, and he's the one who's cutting through, and he's the one who can see what's really happening. And in the allegory of the parallel dimensions or whatever else, the time travel, whatever that thing is it that he is the Cassandra? Is he the figure who can predict everything that's going to happen? He's the only one who can see the future. He can see the tubes, so he's the only one who can see where everybody's going. Like, has he transcended or something? Has he got some knowledge? And then that just looks like a mental health problem to everybody else. And I wonder if that's I guess my take on it. Like, he's clearly disturbed, but who isn't at that age? It's chemical warfare in there.
Exactly, yeah, and that's more the way I think about it. I don't know what this says about me. It's a slightly more bleak outlook, but I think there is this other reading that this is all in the mind of a teenage boy. When you're a teenager, everything does feel like the end of the world. And in some ways, this is a really interesting kind of genre way of putting teenage problems, teenage psychological problems, social problems, whatever else you want to call it, into this kind of end of the world apocalyptic crazy narrative. Clearly this is a boy maybe with some kind of mental health issues, but also in some ways it's just a kind of extreme version of any teenage boy, isn't it? I think, and it's you're at that point, that age where you're starting to become a bit disillusioned with the world. You're losing your faith in authority, in the government, in grown-ups, in your parents, in your teachers, and it's going through that kind of teenage emo phase of your life where everything feels extreme, everything feels like the end of the world.
Well, the other thesis that has just occurred to me is that what you're describing there is a product of extreme privilege. Like, he doesn't have to he doesn't have to really worry about anything. He wants for nothing. And maybe, if somebody had, if someone who didn't look like him and didn't live where he lived and had been born into less fortunate circumstances, they might have the same issues, but they wouldn't have a therapist, and they wouldn't be medicated, and they wouldn't have the same kind of attention drawn to it, and it wouldn't turn into a thing. Maybe it's only allowed to become a thing because he doesn't have, quote unquote, real problems to worry about. And
that's very true as well.
Maybe that's another sort of satirical element to the film of like, well, you guys think you've got it hard, but you're just making stuff up because you're living in this like luxury universe.
I think that's absolutely there as well, isn't it? That again, this whole world is so superficial, and actually all of these characters are kind of interesting and cool and likable in their own weird way, but also the flip side of it is that they're all awful in their own way as well. Even from Drew Barrymore's character to Donnie Darko himself, is that they're all also in some ways privileged and not very nice people, most of them, all quite selfish in their own way as well, right?
Sure.
Everyone is just walking through life with their own selfish problems, not really noticing each.
Got their own selfish tube.
Yeah, their own exactly. They're all following their own little selfish blob, and not really listening to or seeing everyone else out there. And I think the character, I haven't got her name written down. The kind of the bullied girl. What's her name?
Charita.
Yes, Charita. I think Charita, in some ways, kind of feels like a sort of representation of that in a way, doesn't she? This girl who kind of everyone ignores and bullies.
She's the only innocent.
Yes.
And actually, in that final montage, she's the only one smiling.
I noticed that as well. Yeah.
She's the only one who's got like a kind of beatific kind of smile on her face, and she knows that something good has happened.
Something's happened.
Something's happened. Yeah,
she almost, you know, if you went really abstract, she almost exists outside of the film in some weird way. Like she has knowledge outside of the characters, or she's kind of always on the outside looking in at everything like we are, it feels like, you know, which is really interesting.
Shut up!
Yeah, oh, I love her. She's so sweet. And I love it when Donnie comes up to her and he says, I promise one day things are going to be better for you. And she just gets really embarrassed and runs off. But
she's got her Donnie Darko themed exercise book. She's got a massive crush on him.
Oh, yeah.
She's only human.
She's only human. Come on. I mean, he's so cool.
It's Jake Gyllenhaal.
It's Jake Gyllenhaal. Yeah. But and again, it just goes to show, you know, like all of these little minor little characters that are all so interesting in their own way. Now, let me ask you, you're a sci-fi fan. We just talked about devs. You're also a scientist. In my brain, Alex, you're a scientist.
Sure. Maybe once upon a time.
Well, let me ask you.
Don't ask me to explain the film. You're going to ask me about it, aren't you?
Yeah, I want to. Let's put aside the kind of art house psychological subtext for a minute and actually look at the in-world story that's happening here. So, Frank comes to Donnie Darko and he lures him out of the house. So essentially, kind of like sets Donnie on a different path, right? He kind of takes him out of his own sort of almost like a different multiverse version of himself or something, right? Where he ends up in this other parallel universe. But then is it kind of a paradox at the end because his mother goes in that plane that then crashes, and would that plane have crashed if he hadn't?
So the engine is from
bedroom.
The engine is from the future,
right? Yeah.
So because the engine is from a serial that has a serial number on it, and then so they find the engine in his bedroom. Obviously, it lands on his bed, and then but then they find the matching engine that has that serial number already attached to a plane that's working fine, and there's no plane flying. Like someone would notice a plane losing an engine, and there's no missing engine. So the engine is out of time. It is out of its own time. It's moved timelines. It goes through that weird whirlpool thing. So that's kind of your like Deus Ex Machina, except at the beginning of the film, I guess.
Yes.
And so that's what that is.
Yes. And
so then Frank is the person who pulls him out of that, and I guess kicks off a separate timeline. So there's two, there's the original timeline, I guess, is where Donnie gets squashed, and then Frank is the one who pulls him out of it. Now, is Frank an antagonist in this situation? Should Donnie always have died, and is like him pulling him out, like, was that a good thing or a bad thing?
Yeah, and also Frank pulling him out of that means Frank's own death, doesn't it? Because Frank presumably wouldn't have died in the timeline where Donnie Darko dies, because it's Donnie Darko that shoots Frank.
Yeah.
So Frank is causing his own death by luring him to the golf course. Although it's not the real Frank, is it though? It's an imaginary version of Frank,
Yeah. I've made a new friend, real or imaginary. Imaginary.
Exactly.
I just the thing about it is it makes enough emotional sense.
Yes.
For you to go with it.
Yes.
And
agreed.
It makes not enough logical sense that you can still talk about it.
You're so right.
And
it leaves just enough that, like, I was talking about this with Lost Highway recently as well, where the puzzle doesn't quite fit together in a satisfying way, but maybe that's what makes it so good and so much more satisfying, you know?
And we'll come on to the director's cut later, because then we'll talk about that. But I think the lack of resolution is one of the things that makes this film a classic. And because imagine the number of pub debates that have been had, sitting around like with your own take, you've got a take, I've got a take, and intuitively it makes sense. You see Donnie at the end laughing, like it makes sense to him. He knows what's happened. He gets it. He's happy at having revealed the mysteries of the universe. And also, but like the fact, maybe the whole reason for this whole thing is so that Gretchen lives, and maybe that's what this was all about, and she's going to do something special, or she's,
that's it. Well, it's a really interesting thing, isn't it? Because you kind of think, in my head, I always think, yes, that him kind of choosing to die at the end, in some ways has the positive effect, because it means that Frank won't die, it means that Gretchen won't die, but then it also means that child molesting, Patrick Swayze will never be caught as well, which is interesting. And there is I guess there are the positives and the negatives, the variables, I suppose. Yeah,
he gets to, but also then Drew Barrymore doesn't get fired.
Yes.
There's. I think you're right. I think but that's what I like about it as well, is that it's not clean. There's it's not 1 and 0. It's not like, well, here's an obvious thing. You should definitely do this thing because everyone's going to be happy at the end. Like, is everyone actually, like, his family are bereft at the end? Yeah. Absolutely grief stricken. Yeah. That's their lives changed forever. Yeah. And absolutely the sacrifice, like, was it worth it? I don't know if you can answer that question.
No. And to in Donnie's head, like you said, it is. He's laughing. He's kind of happy with his final outcome in a way. It feels like he's finally kind of at peace in a weird way at the end there. But it's. But
I still don't really understand why he is laughing at the end.
No.
Is he just?
And it's a very kind of. It's a kind of knowing laugh in a way that almost like there's a kind of joke on him or a punchline or something, but I'm not entirely sure what that is. I guess we'll never know what that is. It's so deliberately ambiguous.
But he is self-aware the whole way through. There's that lovely scene with him and his mum where he's like, how does it feel to have a wacko for a son? And he's like at one of his lowest ebbs. And she says absolutely the most perfect thing, where she says, it's wonderful.
Yeah, I know. I love that. It's lovely, isn't it? Well, that you could. There's a very David Lynch reading of this, which is that maybe the plane always hit him, and that everything we see in the film is his last kind of dying fantasy of his own pop culture filled version of his own movie about himself. And that this is what his life would have been, except that it doesn't quite all fit into place. And at the end, he realizes that actually he is better and more at peace not going down that path.
I do love that reading. There's that bit where she says, "Donnie Darko, what kind of name is that? You sound like some kind of superhero." And he says, "How do you know I'm not?"
Yeah. And it kind of excuses, not that it really needs excusing, but it excuses the over-stylized, a film that looks like it could have been made by a teenage boy who'd made a film about his life, right? Like we just talked about how kind of film schooly it is and everything else. So,
God, layers. Even now, 19 years later, still layers.
All around me are familiar
Let me ask you then about the ending of this movie, specifically that iconic sort of closing montage where we've got Gary Jules' Mad World. Now, do you remember, Alex, this song back in 2001? This song was everywhere.
Yeah. Wasn't it Christmas number one?
It was Christmas number one.
Yeah. I remember it was in a race with Nizlopi. Do you remember that song about the tractor?
Said I'm Luke, I'm 5, and my dad's Bruce Lee. Drives me around in his JCB.
The JCB song. Oh.
Yes. I love that. In fact, actually, I love the whole score. I mean, we talked about the soundtrack, but Michael Andrews, is it?
Yes.
Who does the score? Kind of really subtle, just sort of piano score throughout. I love it. It's really kind of haunting and beautiful.
It is, but it's also, when it needs to, it's got a touch of the Hans Zimmers. It's got a bit of the ratcheting tension, and like the score for Dunkirk, you know, where it never resolves, and it's always just like edging up the tension. And like,
well, it's quite Chris Nolan-esque, all of this like wormhole business, isn't it?
That's true.
It's great. I mean, do you like that little kind of like final closing moment with the Gary Jules song and all of the different characters that we see, you know, awake at night, and that whole kind of little final closing montage of the film?
Yeah, it feels like there's a few of those, isn't there? There's obviously, you've got Magnolia,
a very of its time. It's
which was very similar. Yeah, and I think like this film, absolutely, the music is a huge part of it. Like, you know, I had the CD soundtrack and I played it to death. Yeah, to death. I loved it so much. Although I always skipped the weird instrumental tracks that were the backing music for the motivational speakers. I was like, don't need to listen to this again.
We don't need that. Yeah,
but yeah, I love it. And like for ages, I didn't realise it was a Tears for Fears cover, another Tears for Fears cover, and it's a It's a proper dancey banger as well.
It is. It's like much more upbeat, isn't it? I think I quite enjoy the Tears for Fears version. I love Tears for Fears, but this particular version of this song I think is so beautiful, it's so haunting, it's so perfect for Donnie Darko, and because it's kind of emo as well, you know.
Sure.
Okay, we're going to wrap up on Donnie Darko shortly, although I do want to ask you, Alex, a little bit about the director's cut. So we're going to talk about the director's cut in a minute. But first of all, let's head on over to Wild About Horror. I, for one, am very excited to hear what Freudian cinephile Mary Wild thinks of Richard Kelly's Donnie Darko.
Hey Mike, Mary Wild reporting again. This week, my psychoanalytic observations turn to Richard Kelly's sci-fi thriller, Donnie Darko, about a troubled teenager who tries to understand the meaning behind his doomsday visions. The representation of paranoid schizophrenia is striking in this cult classic. Jake Gyllenhaal's character repeatedly has visual and auditory hallucinations, but I mainly want to interpret the discursive position of the conspiracy theorist, a topic that incidentally came up in a recent discussion I had with my Projections podcast co-host Sarah Cleaver in the second episode of our Cults on Film series. Donnie Darko takes place during the month of October 1988, in the run-up to the U.S. presidential election. Throughout the film, we see televised news coverage and various discussions related to the merits and failings of Democratic candidate Michael Dukakis and his Republican opponent George H. Bush. We quickly find out that Donnie is a sleepwalker who interacts with Frank, a monstrous figure in a rabbit costume claiming that the world will end in 4 weeks, merely days before the election as it happens. Donnie's full name is Donald J. Darko, which reminds me of Donald J. Trump. Just a coincidence, of course, but we Freudians love happy accidents like this one. Donnie continues to see Frank appear. His psychiatrist believes he's detached from reality and that these are daylight hallucinations. Graham Greene's short story, The Destructors, is assigned at Donnie's high school. The author's birthday, 2nd of October, coincides with the start of the film, when Donnie sleepwalks out of his house. This leads me to believe that the central tenet of Graham Greene's story, that destruction is a form of creation, is the driving force of Donnie Darko, giving the viewer an inside track into a teenage boy's experiential reality, full of absurdism and captivating chaos. Donnie's high school gym teacher is disturbed by ideas contained in The Destructors and begins holding attitude lessons taken from local motivational speaker Jim Cunningham. Donnie becomes convinced that there are obscure forces at work around him and goes on to set fire to Cunningham's house. Firefighters discover child pornography at the motivational speaker's home, and he is promptly arrested. This whole sequence in the film confirms Donnie's suspicion that the person he targeted was a dangerous predator. It affords Donnie a superhero quality of being able to see through hypocrisy and detect nefarious intentions. The fact that Graham Greene's Destructors, so closely linked with the instinct that animates Donnie, is under attack by moralist figures, sets up the narrative's tensions between an oppressive elite and a disaffected underdog rising up to overcome injustice. The looming 1988 presidential election features in the backdrop of the story, but it upholds the motif of a hotly contested balance of power that I believe plagues the mind of the central character. To me, this film feels like being caught in a delusional mind, a cognitive dissonance in which the world's structural integrity and the very fabric of reality are ripped apart. Normal laws of physics no longer apply. Enormous objects inexplicably drop from the sky and land on Donnie's house. Just like in René Magritte's painting, the surrealist confusion of something really big dominating a familiar space, giving rise to a sense of the uncanny so often undermining the comfort of the home, introducing a threatening dimension. In the topsy-turvy world of this film, even time travel is possible. Nothing is grounded. It seems we can't really rely on anything or trust anyone. Much of Donnie Darko successfully invokes the misgivings that someone, something, is responsible for everything going awry. As viewers, we are compelled to identify with Donnie and take on his preoccupations. Who is doing this to him? Suspicions grow into full-blown conspiracy theories, and my proposition is that this specific discursive position necessarily occurs in a transitional time, when the country goes to the polls to elect its next leader, accentuating the gap in the symbolic order. Psychoanalytically speaking, when the parental authority figure of the president is in flux or in question, it creates a chasm in the subjective space, potentially setting off a psychotic response that is comparable to R.D. Laing's notion of ontological insecurity, in which the world feels unreal, identity is in question and lacks temporal continuity, and our sense of self is partially divorced from the body. The prospect of momentarily losing the secure connection with parental hegemony in which we are obliged to confront our capacity for aggressive and illicitly erotic impulses. In other words, we must govern ourselves in the interim period, as we find ourselves morally adrift, between governments, fatherless, a feeling comparable to anxiously awaiting the result of a paternity test on Jeremy Kyle. It is precisely in this fragile state that the conspiratorial mind is activated, leading the subject to produce additional explanations, a surplus of signifiers, however outlandish they may be, to cover up the black hole in the discourse. It can feel quite tempting to perceive malevolent forces where there are none, shadowy figures in cahoots, plotting against us. But it's all a figment of our imagination, a coping mechanism. We're only trying to make sense of what feels like a chaotic world. Donald J. conjuring up extraordinary narratives to light his path in the dark. Sound familiar? Catch you next time.
A big thank you to the wonderful Mary Wild for this week's Wild About Horror segment. And don't forget, if you want to hear more from Mary, you can listen to her podcast, the Projections Podcast, which she hosts with Sarah Cleaver. And you can also check out information about her upcoming courses and various other bits and pieces on her Twitter. Follow her there at PsychStar. Okay, Alex, we're going to wrap up on Donnie Darko in a minute, but first of all, before we finish, I've just got to ask you about the director's cut. Now, I, to this day, have never seen the director's cut. It was released a few years after the original theatrical Donnie Darko, and I've heard nothing but bad stuff about it. You've taken one for the team, haven't you? And given it a little watch for the podcast, so I've got to ask you, I mean, a lot of people, what I've heard is that this film kind of takes away all of the ambiguity, all of the mystery, and kind of ruins what was so great about the original. What are your thoughts on that?
I would have to say I agree with that assessment. I think if this is truly the director's vision, if it had been released in that way, we wouldn't be talking about it now.
Interesting.
It loses its classic status. A lot of the things that get put in there really date it. Yeah. There's some techniques in it and some of the kind of graphics that get used that are like horribly dated. And also completely unnecessary. It over-explains the sci-fi elements, like to the point where it explains them by showing you pages from inside the book, The Philosophy of Time Travel.
Oh no!
And so it just shows you the page, and then you have to read all this stuff about. I've written it down because it was so annoying. About tangent universes, artifacts, the manipulated dead, the living receiver, the insurance trap. Black holes, all sorts of things like that. The importance of water and metal being the only things that can penetrate, like all this stuff that I'm going to desperately try and forget. That is just unnecessary. There's more kind of family dynamic stuff, which is over explains the relationships. Things that are better left unsaid are explicitly stated. It sort of changes the fabric of some of the relationships. So you find out in the director's cut that Donnie is actually anybody who doesn't want the director's cut spoiled don't want to know about how it spoils it, then like skip this section. But Donnie's on placebos. He's not on medication at all. So the fact that he's stopped taking his medication means nothing, because they were placebos the whole time.
Interesting. So it's kind of doubling down on that Donnie isn't ill, but there is real time travel stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. They introduce this weird like interstitials thing where there's like a blinking eye and then waves crashing on a beach and then like lines of code are coming up. And
oh my god!
Yeah, it's so bad.
What an entirely different film as well.
It's mad. It's so
How
mad.
Weird.
And then there's this whole, the God thing gets explained. There's a whole explanation of the difference between an atheist and agnostic. There's a whole separate section. You get a lot more Drew Barrymore in the director's cut, and there's a whole separate section where after the Destructors is banned, then she has to teach them Watership Down, which obviously Year One has chosen because she thinks it's about fluffy bunnies and it's going to be a safe thing to discuss.
Right.
But then there's obviously the parallels between Watership Down being a bunny and Frank being a bunny is like super on the nose.
Oh no.
And yeah, it's just all a bit much. And too much to explain. It's like, imagine if David Lynch didn't let you find out the subtext, he just explained it to you. Explain what was going on.
It's awful, isn't it? It's a real interesting argument, I mean, I say this as a producer myself, that, producer cuts, maybe they are better. I mean, there are very few director's cuts out there that I think are actually better than the theatricals.
There you go. That's interesting. I think... I haven't even said the most egregious thing that he does in the director's cut is he moves the music around.
What?
So it doesn't even start with The Killing Moon.
Oh,
it starts with In Excess, Never Tear Us Apart, which is a great song, but it's not the song for the beginning of Donnie Darko.
How weird.
And already, like, watching it, I was like, now I'm on edge. What else are you going to do?
Yeah.
And the bit where the tubes come out is where he uses Killing Moon. And I'm like, but what's happening? This is
weird.
I don't like it. Because then what happens is the lyrics of those songs then become a literal interpretation of what's happening in the film. Like, the whole thing is just too literal. That's my problem, I guess, with
it's a bit sad, isn't it? And that's the thing about Richard Kelly. I mean, he's obviously got so many ideas. He's bursting clearly at the seams with ideas and concepts, but maybe they just need honing in a little bit, because
this is another example in my anti-auteur theory. Like, I hate auteur theory. It takes a village to make a film. It takes all sorts of different people contributing in all sorts of different ways, some of which you don't even notice, you don't even know. I think you're spot on to talk about producers. Like, a lot of people don't really understand what a producer's job is. And sometimes it's to save the director from themselves, and it's to find the story, and to rescue the narrative from the vision.
Yeah, I mean, look at some of the big kind of directors that have become auteurs, quote unquote, and that have complete creative control. I mean, I long for the early days of Quentin Tarantino when his films were a little bit more disciplined, or Chris Nolan, to be honest, as well. And there's a lot of people like that they get to a point. And actually, let's be honest, even David Lynch too. I mean, David Lynch did Inland Empire, which is just an absolute 3-hour sprawling mess. Because
I still haven't managed it.
It's so difficult. It's so difficult to watch because it's like his brain just splurged onto a screen with no direction, funnily enough. And it's hard. And I think, like, you're exactly right, these the most successful films often take a team. They take hundreds of people kind of working away at shaping a story, I think, a lot of the time.
And when you've got a director who is effectively the conductor, I guess, like if you're using an orchestra metaphor, and but you're empowering everybody to help tell your story and your narrative, and everybody is a part of that. Like, how important are the art directors and the set dressers and the costume designers and everybody, the actors, obviously, but everybody, the background artists, like everybody who is contributing to telling that story. If you're devolving the power to them, it makes it for a much richer lived in experience, I think, than this. Or if you're someone like David Lynch who can channel all of those elements, like that feels like I'm inarticulately trying to say, like, the difference between an auteur film and an authored film. I think something that feels authored is what I'm always after, and this feels massively authored by Richard Kelly. It's like it's got him running through everything, but also it doesn't feel Kubrickian in terms of, like, he wasn't writing everybody's names, all the lines on the blackboard. He wasn't doing all of that stuff.
Exactly. Yeah, you're so right. And it's really interesting then when you look at his follow-up. Did you ever see Southland Tales, his sort of follow-up film?
I never have.
You've dodged a bullet. You've dodged a bullet.
Well, listen, you've dodged Southland Tales for me. I've dodged Donnie Darko Director's Cut for you.
Yeah, exactly. It's 3 hours long, and it's very incoherent, and I was really excited to see it because it was the new Richard Kelly film, and it was starring Sarah Michelle Gellar and Sean William Scott, and it had all these cool people in it, and it's just a bloated mess, unfortunately. And I suppose that's maybe the result of having such a successful first film, that maybe he had a bit more freedom for his next one, So it's a sad thing. I guess it happened to M. Night Shyamalan too, and he started getting better when he joined Blumhouse, and you've got Jason Blum kind of cutting your budget.
I feel like everybody's going to get better when they join Blumhouse.
Again, producer, you get team up with Jason Blum and things will get better for you.
Maybe we should get Richard Kelly back with Jason Blum. That would be fun.
That'd be a great idea, actually.
Listen, you've interviewed both of them. Give them a call.
Yeah,
you can make this happen, Mike.
I'll set them up.
You heard it here first.
He actually was a really lovely guy. I was really worried that Richard Kelly himself in person might be a bit of a kind of pretentious film school wanker. I don't know why. There was a bit of me that thought, is he going to be quite bitter about his career and about, is he going to think that he's better than, his career has allowed him to be, etc.? actually he was really humble and really sweet and really self-effacing and you know, had nothing but like lovely memories and lovely things to say about Donnie Darko and about the producer's cut of Donnie Darko as well. So maybe he's grown in the years since or something.
Or maybe he was just said, someone said to him, like, we've got an opportunity to make a whole load of more money out of Donnie Darko. What we really want is a director's cut. And we don't know that he didn't make all those cuts the first time around himself.
Well, that's so true.
And then he was just like, oh, actually, it might have been, a marketing person saying like, oh, I need an excuse to sell Donnie Darko again. Can you put another 20 minutes in it and we'll sell it as a director's cut?
Totally, you know.
We don't actually know the story behind that, so to give him credit, like, we shouldn't make assumptions.
And I interviewed him because it was the 15th anniversary of Donnie Darko, and it just goes to show that he's still dining out, so to speak, on Donnie Darko. And that, like, when you've had one film that's as big as this, I mean, weirdly, you know, the film it wasn't a success. It wasn't hugely successful. I think it was also sort of unlucky timing because it came out in the year of 9/11. There was a whole plane crash image in the trailer, and a lot of people kind of avoided seeing it. Cinemas avoided playing it in America, and it was one of those word of mouth films. I think you know, it's one of those like cult classics, wasn't it? That kind of people were telling their friends about, or people were reading. I remember reading a 5-star review of it in Empire magazine and being like, "Oh, I need to, must watch this." So it was one of those that's kind of slowly grown over the years, isn't it? And now it's often in lists of, again, Empire. It's in their 500 greatest films ever made list. It's now kind
deservedly
of
so.
Yeah, it's considered one of the all-time greats, isn't it?
I think it's a modern classic, and I'm so pleased that it exists in the theatrical cut in the way that it does.
Yeah,
and open for interpretation.
I know, I love it so much. So, final question for you then. It is approaching its 20th anniversary. It's nearly 20 years old now, which is insane. Do you think it's aged well? Does this film still hold up? Would you still recommend Donnie Darko to newbies, to new fans?
I think if you've never seen it, you should definitely watch it. And I think if you have seen it, you should definitely watch it again.
Yeah, yeah.
That's my recommendation of the day.
Very well said. Yeah,
also, if you haven't seen it while you're listening to this podcast, we've just ruined the film. I'm sorry if you haven't seen it.
I'm always surprised, actually, the amount of people that have written in that say that they don't watch the films or haven't seen the films, but just like listening to. Because I've had some people write in to say, "Oh, I'm too scared to watch a lot of the films, but like I just listen to you guys talk about it, and that kind of is enough," sort of thing, which is really interesting.
Yeah, I could see that, but because I do that with Zobo with a shotgun.
Oh yeah. Me too.
And I've been doing that with your extreme horror series. Like, I don't want to watch any of those films, but
yeah,
I'm glad you have.
Yeah. FYI, Alex, I wouldn't recommend Guinea Pig 1 and 2.
I saw on your Instagram. I can't believe that Instagram hasn't been taken down, because I looked at the picture and I was like, this does not look like a fun time at the cinema.
No, I know. I did actually get somebody sent me a DM on Twitter and were like, "Could you stop posting those sorts of pictures without a warning, please?" I was like, "Yeah, sorry. We are a horror account, but
yeah,
okay."
I think that's all right." So I highly recommend it, and I think I'm so pleased I had the opportunity to watch it again, and it was weirdly comforting in this year of 2020.
I know what you mean. It's a very comforting film, and it's such a, like you put it perfectly at the very beginning of our chat, where it's such an easy film to watch in a way, even though it is not an easy film to understand. And yet, that is, for me, one of the best types of films that is challenging, but still completely accessible, Like, it still invites you in a very kind of mainstream, accessible way, I think, into this story, even though it's going to then confuse the hell out of you. You know?
I don't think I'll ever get bored of watching Donnie Darko.
Yeah.
Even 20 years later, finding new things and talking about it with you, finding new parts to it has just been lovely. So I'm sorry everybody else had to listen to us banging on about it, but I've had a lovely time.
Well, me too, and this is what I've loved the most, actually, about this series, because all of these, like, extremely challenging, impenetrable films, getting down to just sort of sit down for a solid hour and try and sort of unpick some of them has been really interesting, and you kind of learn things almost as you're watching them and as you're talking about them, however many years on since you first saw it, or however many times you've watched it since, I think like having a reason to sit and watch something and talk about it like this podcast is a good way of kind of making yourself think about it even more, I think,
100%. And just listening to all of your chats has done the same thing for me. So
lovely. Well, Alex, thank you so much. It's been such a pleasure to chat to you, even if it is, via Zoom.
Oh, I know. I hate Zoom.
Yeah, me too.
But
we all hate Zoom.
It's nice to be back.
It's lovely to have you back. Remind us one more time, if people want to come and find you and chat to you on social media, etc., where can they find you?
You can come and find me. I'm on Alex J. Ayling. I might break I'm on a bit of a Twitter hiatus, but I might break it when this episode comes out, just so I can chat to people about Donnie Darko.
Yes.
But other than that, I'm on Instagram. That's why I'm trying that out for a while.
Okay, amazing. Alex, thank you so much.
Thanks, Mike. Bye.
And that's it for this week. Thank you so much for listening, and a huge thank you to my brilliant guest, Alex Ayling. Oh, it's such a pleasure to have Alex Ayling back on the podcast at last. So, we had so much good stuff to say about Donnie Darko. What do you guys think? Any big Donnie Darko fans out there? Any Donnie Darko skeptics? Are there any of you that aren't that big a fan? I would love to hear your thoughts. Please do get in touch. The email address is evolutionofhorror@gmail.com. You can also find us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and Letterboxd. And if you want to discuss this week's film with fellow listeners, then you can. Join the discussion group. That's the Evolution of Horror discussion group, and that can be found on Facebook. We also have a subreddit, reddit.com/evolutionofhorror. You can find all previous episodes of this podcast on our website. Simply head over to evolutionofhorror.com. If you want to support this podcast, sign up to our Patreon, patreon.com/evolutionofhorror. You can find this podcast on all major podcast platforms, including Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Libsyn, Acast, Podbean, and Spotify. If you get a sec, we would be hugely grateful if you could spare the time to leave an Apple Podcasts rating or review, which really helps us get discovered by new listeners. Okay then, onwards to next week then. Next week it's a hardcore double bill. In fact, the next few weeks are going to be pretty hardcore. I would even go so far as to say extreme. Next week, we're going to be heading over to Asia. I'm going to be joined by Tim Coleman, and we're going to be discussing Park Chan-wook's Oldboy from 2003 and Takashi Miike's Audition from 1999. Oof. Bring a drink for that one. Join us next week for all of this and more on the Evolution of Horror.